Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into a really complex topic, one that gets talked about a lot but maybe isn't always, fully grasped. Personality disorders.
Mm-hmm.
We're using the DSM-5 as our guide here. So think of this as us trying to pull out the key stuff, the essentials, to give a clearer picture of these ways people think, feel, and behave.
Exactly. We've really dug into the DSM-5, the official manual, to kind of boil down what these enduring patterns are all about. Patterns that, really shape how someone sees themselves and deals with the world.
Right.
The goal is just to help everyone understand the core things that make each one distinct.
Okay, so fundamentally then, what is a personality disorder according to the DSM-5? Like, what's the basic definition we need to hang on to?
Well, the core idea is it's a pattern, a really persistent and inflexible pattern of how someone experiences things internally and how they behave outwardly.
Okay.
And this pattern is pretty different from what you'd expect in their culture. It's not just a phase, it's ingrained, shows up in lots of different situations, personal and social.
Yeah.
And crucially, it usually starts showing up in adolescence or early adulthood, stays pretty stable over time, and importantly, causes distress or problems in functioning day to day.
Distress or impairment, right?
Yeah. And for diagnosing someone under 18, generally these patterns need to be around for at least a year. There's one exception, though, antisocial personality disorder, which has different age rules we can get into.
Got it. So it's not about like temporary difficulties or just a bad week. It's a really deep set way of being that causes ongoing trouble.
Exactly that.
Now, the DSM-5 puts these into clusters, right? A, B, and C. Why do they do that? What can you tell us about those groups?
Right, the clusters. They're basically a way to organize things to make sense of these different conditions. So cluster A is generally where you find disorders with odd or eccentric behavior.
Odd or eccentric, okay.
Cluster B is more about dramatic, emotional, or kind of erratic behavior.
Right.
And cluster C groups together the ones where anxiety or fearfulness is really the main thing.
Yeah.
It just helps see some common threads within each group, even though, each specific disorder is unique. We'll go through each cluster and the disorders in them to get a better handle on how they actually look.
Makes sense, like sorting similar ideas. Let's dive into cluster A then, the odd or eccentric group. First up is paranoid personality disorder. What are the absolute must-knows about this one?
Okay, paranoid personality disorder. The absolute core feature is this pervasive, deep-seated distrust and suspiciousness of other people.
Pervasive, okay.
Yeah, individuals with this pattern tend to interpret others' motives as, well, malicious or harmful, even when there's no real evidence for it. The key things are how widespread this suspicion is and that it's often unfounded. It really isolates them.
So it's way more than just being a bit wary sometimes. It's like looking at the world through suspicious glasses all the time.
Precisely. Yeah. The DSM-5 lists specific symptoms, and you need at least 4 of them for a diagnosis.
Okay, like what?
Things like suspecting others are exploiting or deceiving them without good reason, being really preoccupied with doubts about the loyalty of friends or colleagues, again, unjustified doubts,
Right.
being reluctant to confide in people because they fear the information will be used against them, reading hidden negative meanings into perfectly innocent remarks or events,
Wow.
holding grudges for a long time, perceiving attacks on their character that others don't see and reacting really angrily or counterattacking, and often having recurrent unjustified suspicions about a partner's fidelity.
Yeah, you can really see how that constant suspicion would just poison relationships and life in general.
Mm.
Okay, next in cluster A, schizoid personality disorder. How's this different from that paranoia?
Schizoid is quite different, actually. It's characterized more by a pervasive pattern of detachment from social relationships and a really restricted range of emotional expression when they are interacting with people.
Detachment, okay.
Yeah, unlike the suspicion in paranoid, the core here seems to be a genuine lack of interest or desire for close relationships. They nearly always choose solitary activities.
So they prefer being alone.
Very much so. Little to no interest in sexual experiences with others. They seem to take pleasure in few, if any, activities. Often they don't have close friends, maybe besides immediate family. And what's really noticeable is they seem indifferent to praise or criticism from others. They often come across as emotionally cold, detached, or, having a very flat effect.
So less about fearing social interaction and more just not interested. And emotionally quite reserved.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, that brings us to the last one in cluster A, schizotypal personality disorder. This name sounds like it might involve some more maybe unusual kinds of experiences.
You're right on track there. Schizotypal involves significant social and interpersonal deficits. There's this acute discomfort with close relationships or reduced capacity for them, but it's also accompanied by cognitive or perceptual distortions and eccentricities in behavior. The DSM needs at least 5 specific symptoms for this one.
Okay, so what kind of cognitive or perceptual stuff are we talking about? Like unusual thinking?
Yeah, it can show up in a few ways. They might have ideas of reference that's feeling like everyday things, events have a special, unusual meaning just for them.
Like a news report being a secret message to them?
Exactly like that. Or odd beliefs, magical thinking that doesn't quite fit cultural norms, like believing in telepathy, clairvoyance, that sort of thing. They
Interesting.
might have unusual perceptual experiences, like bodily illusions. Their thinking and speech can be odd too, maybe vague, tangential, overly elaborate, metaphorical.
Okay.
Suspiciousness or paranoid ideas can be present too. Their emotional expression might seem inappropriate or constricted, and their behavior or appearance can strike others as odd or peculiar.
Right.
Similar to schizoid, they often lack close friends outside the family, and they have this excessive social anxiety that doesn't really fade even with familiarity. Interestingly, someone with schizotypal might actually say they want closeness, but their odd behaviors and social difficulties often get in the way, leading them to prefer being alone despite that desire.
It sounds like cluster A, sort of overarching theme. Is this real distance from typical social life, whether it's driven by suspicion or disinterest or these kind of unusual thoughts and perceptions?
That's a good summary, yeah.
Okay, let's move to cluster B then. You describe this one as traumatic, emotional, or erratic. First up is antisocial personality disorder. This term gets thrown around a lot, sometimes pretty loosely. What's the actual clinical picture?
Right, antisocial personality disorder. Clinically, it's about a persistent pattern of disregarding and violating the rights of other people. This pattern starts in childhood or early adolescence and carries on into adulthood.
Okay, starting young.
Yeah. Specifically, the pattern needs to be evident since age 15, but the diagnosis itself isn't given until the person is at least 18. And a really crucial piece is that there needs to be evidence of conduct disorder before age 15.
Conduct disorder.
Yeah, conduct disorder involves this repetitive pattern where a kid or adolescent violates basic rights of others or major societal norms and rules. Think aggression, destruction of property, deceitfulness, serious rule violations.
Got it. So there's a history there. And what behaviors characterize antisocial personality disorder in adulthood?
So the DSM lists several, and you need at least 3 of these since age 15. Things like failing to conform to social norms about lawful behavior, so repeatedly doing things that could get them arrested.
Right.
Deceitfulness is a big one, lying, using aliases, conning people for profit or just for pleasure.
Right.
Impulsivity, failing to plan ahead. Irritability and aggressiveness, like getting into physical fights.
Right.
Reckless disregard for their own safety or others. Consistent irresponsibility, maybe not holding down a job, not paying debts, and a real lack of remorse, seeming indifferent to hurting or mistreating someone, or maybe rationalizing it away.
That's pretty impactful.
Definitely. And you often see other things alongside this, like an inflated sense of self-importance, maybe a lack of empathy, and sometimes the superficial charm they can use to manipulate.
Oh.
It's also worth mentioning, while it's generally a stable pattern, some of the more overt stuff, like impulsive acts or criminal behavior, sometimes can lessen a bit as people get older, maybe into their 40s or later.
Interesting. Okay, a pattern with really serious consequences.
Mm.
Next in cluster B is borderline personality disorder, BPD. Another one we hear a lot about, and you mentioned earlier there's been progress in treatment.
Yes, borderline personality disorder, or BPD. This one is characterized by this pervasive instability in relationships and their sense of self and their emotions, and also marked impulsivity.
Instability across the board, basically.
Pretty much. It typically starts by early adulthood and shows up in lots of different areas of life. For a diagnosis, you need at least 5 specific symptoms.
Okay, and what are those key features? What does that instability look like?
Well, there are frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, whether it's real or just feared. A pattern of really unstable and intense relationships, often swinging between idealizing someone, thinking they're perfect, and then devaluing them, seeing them as awful.
That's the splitting thing people talk about.
Exactly. That's often called splitting. Then there's identity disturbance, a really unstable sense of who they are. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that could be self-damaging, like spending sprees, unsafe sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating.
Right.
Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-harming behavior. Affective instability, meaning really rapid and intense mood shifts, often triggered by events.
Yeah.
Chronic feelings of emptiness.
Wow, that sounds exhausting.
It is. Also, inappropriate intense anger or trouble controlling anger, and sometimes under stress, transient paranoid thoughts or severe dissociative symptoms, feeling detached from reality or themselves.
That paints a really vivid picture of intense internal and external chaos. You mentioned the course that there can be improvement. What does the research say about the longer term?
Yeah, the DSM notes it's most often diagnosed in young adulthood, say 19 to 34, and the symptoms can be really severe then. But importantly, long-term studies show many people do improve significantly over time.
That's good to hear.
Research suggests that by, say, age 40, a good number of individuals might not even meet the full criteria anymore. They might achieve remission.
Remission, okay.
Though it seems like some symptoms might improve faster than others, like impulsive behaviors, substance use. Recklessness might get better quicker, while the emotional instability, the anger, those might stick around longer.
Right. Still highlights the importance of treatment.
Absolutely. Ongoing support is key.
And the DSM touches on what might contribute to BPD developing, right? The etiology.
Yes, it briefly covers different theories. Psychodynamic ideas, for instance, often look back at early childhood, the relationship with caregivers. Some linked it to problems forming a stable sense of self early on.
Like object relations.
Exactly. Object relations theory looks at how those early interactions shape our internal templates for self and others, which might be fragmented in BPD. Mahler's separation individuation theory suggests issues when a child is developing that sense of being separate. Kernberg talked about adverse early interactions, maybe inconsistent or extreme caregiving, leading to defense mechanisms like splitting.
Okay, interesting historical perspectives. And then there's the biosocial model, which seems quite influential now.
Very influential. Marsha Linehan's biosocial model is key here. It suggests BPD comes from a mix, a biological vulnerability combined with an invalidating environment.
Biological vulnerability.
Meaning like a predisposition to feel emotions more intensely, react more strongly, higher emotional sensitivity.
Okay, and the invalidating environment.
That's an environment where the person's emotional experiences are frequently dismissed, punished, maybe told they're wrong or inappropriate.
I see.
So this constant mismatch, intense internal feelings meeting external dismissal, leads to major problems learning how to regulate emotions. And that difficulty with emotion regulation is seen as the core problem driving the symptoms.
And that understanding directly led to DBT, Dialectical Behavior Therapy.
Precisely. DBT, developed by Linehan, is really the leading treatment designed specifically for BPD, based directly on that biosocial model. It blends cognitive behavioral techniques with mindfulness and acceptance.
Dialectical meaning, bringing opposites together.
Exactly. Acceptance and change. DBT has a few main parts. There's group skills training, teaching practical skills in 4 areas: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness.
Okay, concrete skills.
Then individual therapy helps apply those skills to the person's specific life problems. And phone coaching offers support between sessions, helping use skills in real-time crises.
Right.
And the research is really strong. DBT has been shown time and again to reduce things like therapy dropout, hospital stays, self-harm, and suicidal behaviors.
It's really powerful how understanding the why can lead to such effective how to help. Okay, continuing with cluster B, we have histrionic personality disorder. How does this one show up?
Histrionic personality disorder. The core pattern here is excessive emotionality and attention-seeking behavior. People with this pattern feel uncomfortable, even distressed, when they aren't the center of attention.
So the need for attention is really the driving force.
Very much so. The DSM lists criteria, and you need at least 5. Things like being uncomfortable when not the center of attention, interactions often being inappropriately sexually seductive or provocative,
Okay.
displaying emotions that shift rapidly and seem shallow, consistently using their physical appearance to draw attention, having a style of speech that's really impressionistic, lacks detail.
Vague but dramatic.
Kind of, yeah. Showing self-dramatization, theatricality, exaggerated emotions, being easily influenced by others or circumstances, and tending to see relationships as much more intimate than they actually are.
Okay, yeah, paints a clear picture of needing to be noticed. The final one in cluster B, narcissistic personality disorder. Another term that's definitely entered popular use, maybe not always accurately. What are the actual diagnostic points?
Right, narcissistic personality disorder. Clinically, it's a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a deep need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. This usually starts by early adulthood and shows up across different situations.
Grandiosity, need for admiration, lack of empathy. Got it.
And the DSM specifies needing at least 5 specific symptoms.
What are those key symptoms?
Okay, so having a grandiose sense of self-importance, exaggerating achievements, expecting to be seen as superior without actually, having the accomplishments to back it up.
Right.
Being preoccupied with fantasies, unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, ideal love, believing they're special and unique and should only associate with other high-status people or institutions. Leading excessive admiration. Having a strong sense of entitlement, unreasonable expectations of favorable treatment or automatic compliance. Being interpersonally exploitative, taking advantage of others.
Oof.
Lacking empathy, unwilling or unable to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. Often being envious of others or believing others envy them. And showing arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes.
Yeah, that definitely describes someone very self-involved and lacking consideration for others. Okay, that wraps up Cluster B. Now for the final cluster. Cluster C, anxious and fearful behaviors. First is avoidant personality disorder. How does this one manifest?
Avoidant personality disorder. This is characterized by a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and being hypersensitive to negative evaluation.
Hypersensitive to criticism.
Extremely. People with this disorder are intensely afraid of rejection, criticism, or disapproval in social settings. The driving force is this profound fear of negative judgment.
So the fear of what people might think is absolutely central.
Absolutely. The DSM needs at least 4 characteristic symptoms. These include avoiding jobs or activities with significant interpersonal contact due to fears of criticism or rejection.
Okay.
Being unwilling to get involved with people unless they're certain they'll be liked. Showing restraint in intimate relationships because they fear being shamed or ridiculed. Being preoccupied with being criticized or rejected socially.
Very isolating.
Terribly. Being inhibited in new social situations because they feel inadequate. Viewing themselves as socially inept, personally unappealing or inferior, and being unusually reluctant to take personal risks or try new things because they might be embarrassing.
Wow, that sounds incredibly painful and limiting, all driven by that fear of judgment. Next, in Cluster C, dependent personality disorder. What's the core need or fear driving this one?
Dependent personality disorder. This involves a pervasive and excessive need to be taken care of by others. This leads to submissive, clinging behavior and intense fears of separation.
Need to be taken care of.
Yeah, these individuals find it incredibly difficult to make independent decisions. They rely heavily on others for reassurance, for direction, in almost all major life areas. The core is a real lack of self-reliance and this deep fear of being unable to manage on their own.
So a profound difficulty with just being autonomous.
Yes, exactly. And it shows up in several ways. The DSM lists at least 5 symptoms needed, like difficulty making everyday decisions without tons of advice and reassurance, needing others to take responsibility for most major areas of their life, difficulty disagreeing with others because they fear losing support or approval, trouble starting projects on their own because they lack confidence in their judgment or abilities,
Right.
going to excessive lengths to get nurturance and support, sometimes even volunteering for unpleasant tasks, feeling uncomfortable or helpless when alone due to exaggerated fears of not being able to care for themselves.
That sounds really difficult.
Yeah, and urgently seeking another relationship for care and support when one ends, and being unrealistically preoccupied with fears of being left to take care of themselves.
Really highlights that fear of independence and intense reliance on others. Okay, finally, Cluster C brings us to obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD. And you stressed earlier this is not the same as OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. That's crucial.
Absolutely crucial distinction, yeah.
So what defines OCPD?
Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD, is about a persistent preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and control, mental and interpersonal control. But this comes at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency.
Okay.
Unlike OCD, there are no true obsessions, those intrusive, unwanted thoughts or compulsions, the repetitive behaviors done to reduce anxiety from obsessions. OCPD is more about this rigid adherence to rules, order, control.
So the drive isn't about neutralizing an anxious thought like an OCD. It's more about maintaining this perfect control.
Exactly. It's a different underlying mechanism. The DSM requires at least 4 symptoms here. Things like being preoccupied with details, rules, lists, order, organization, or schedules, sometimes so much that the main point of the activity gets lost.
Losing the forest for the trees.
Precisely. Showing perfectionism that actually interferes with getting tasks done, like not being able to finish something because their own standards are impossibly high.
Ah,
Being excessively devoted to work and productivity, often excluding leisure activities and friendships. Being overconscientious, scrupulous, inflexible about morality, ethics, or values things not accounted for by cultural or religious identification.
right.
Being unable to discard worn-out or worthless objects, even without sentimental value. Being reluctant to delegate tasks unless others do things exactly their way. Adopting a miserly spending style, hoarding money for future catastrophes. And showing rigidity and stubbornness.
That really clarifies the difference. It's this pervasive, rigid need for control impacting everything. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground, all three clusters, the specific disorders within them based on the DSM-5. It's dense stuff. What's the big picture takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to grasp is that personality disorders are these enduring, pervasive patterns. They aren't fleeting moods or situations. They significantly shape a person's inner world and how they interact with everything and everyone around them, often causing real distress or impairment.
Enduring and pervasive, right?
Yeah. And while the clusters group similar styles, each specific disorder has its own unique fingerprint, its own set of features. Understanding those distinctions is really key to moving past, broad stereotypes and appreciating the complexity here.
Absolutely. We really hope this deep dive has helped provide, a clearer, more structured way to think about these complex patterns, maybe a framework for recognizing the differences without getting lost in the jargon.
Exactly. And, thinking about all this, especially the developmental bits we touched on, like how early environments might play a role, like in Linehan's model, it leads to a pretty interesting final thought.
Oh, yeah.
Well, what are the broader implications for us as a society and how we understand and maybe even address these deeply ingrained patterns? Does it make us think differently about early support, about prevention, about how our social environments might play a role, for better or worse?
Mm, that is definitely something to chew on. How much is nature versus nurture, and what role can society play?
Yeah.
A really provocative question to end with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into personality disorders.
My pleasure.
Until our next exploration, take care, everyone.